is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, let's do a quick tech check and make sure that the audio is working, the video is working. I think I did the show screen. So let's see. Looks like Robert's here, and Kristen, I know you can see what's going on. Is everything looking okay and sounding okay? Can you see? Can you hear? If you would let me know in the question box for those of you who are just joining in, and hey, Suzanne, you'll just type in the question box and let me know if you can hear okay and if you can see the slides. It says accounting best practices for small nonprofits. Then I'll know that everything is okay and we're good to go. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Suzanne. Appreciate you. All right, let's see. Oh, I've got 3 o'clock straight up. So let's go ahead and get started. I have a feeling that we're going to wind up with lots more that we could say in the next hour than we're going to have space for. And I want to make sure that we take advantage of every last little bit of it today. So here we are. It's Project SmartSprout. It's December 6th. Thank you all for being here. I know this is right in the middle of the busy holiday season, and thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be here with us and be part of this. I have with me today, let's see if I can only go one slide at a time, my dear friend Greg McRae, who is CEO and head cheese at Foundation Group. Greg, you want to say hey?
Good afternoon.
I was thinking earlier about how long we've known each other and what I could say about you by way of introduction, and there's quite a lot actually, but I think I'll be really nice and just say, for everybody listening, Greg is one of the brightest people I know when it comes to nonprofit bookkeeping, accounting, compliance, all of those kind of things that are not the sexy fun side of nonprofit, but you gotta take care of it or really bad things can happen. And I'm so excited that Greg is here with us today. He is an amazing, he's an amazing resource and has so much knowledge. I'm really glad you're here. Is there anything you want to add to that by way of introduction, just to let people know about your background?
Hard to improve on that. Well, we've got an entire team here at Foundation Group that puts all of their efforts toward helping empower nonprofits to stay on top of their compliance concerns. And a big part of what we do is helping new organizations get started. We work with anywhere from 500 to 700 new startups every year, in addition to all the ones that we're working on with regard to Form 990, charitable solicitation, registration, and that sort of thing. And you may see on the slide the EA designation after my name. That is a tax specialist designation with the IRS. So this is something that we invest our time and energy into full time.
Well, that is, and it's awesome. It's awesome. Didn't you tell me one time that sometimes the IRS calls you to ask you questions about stuff?
Well, what we find anymore is there's been so much turnover in the exempt organizations division that our average staff member here knows a lot more about tax exemption rules than the IRS agents they're talking to in Cincinnati about a client case.
That's awesome.
And challenging.
No pressure at all, right?
Right, exactly.
So those of you who are here listening in, whether you're live with us or listening to the recording, you're in good hands. And don't forget that Greg and Shannon Zobel, who is part of Greg's team, they're in our Facebook group. So if you ever have a question about something, especially the things we talk about today, you're welcome to post it in there, and you can either tag Greg or tag me, and I'll go find him for you. And he's happy to come through and answer questions about things for us. So let's jump in today and talk about accounting best practices for small nonprofits. First of all, I want to talk about why this matters. Greg, you want to just give us some thoughts about why it's important for especially small nonprofits to get the accounting and the bookkeeping right from the get-go.
Yeah, and we could spend, honestly, Sandy, we could spend a whole hour right here. And I think what I'll do is just kind of give the quick hit on this, because this answer is going to be really fleshed out with all the other things we're going to talk about. But the reality is, for a small organization, especially one that's in the startup phase, it is so much easier to get this right at the beginning than to try to fix it later. I can tell you that one of the biggest headaches that we have as a firm that deals with these issues with clients every day, the biggest messes we deal with are situations that started out badly and got worse. And, sometimes this is at the hands of volunteers within the organization that just don't know what they're doing, or it could be neglect. It could be a professional that someone hired that really isn't skilled at the nonprofit side of things. But the other part of why it matters is you're accountable. And we'll talk a lot about that as we go along today, but you're accountable to both your state and to the IRS with regard to the numbers you're keeping track of and the way in which you're doing it. If there's no other reason, it's that. But we could go into reasons regarding donor relations and on it goes, but it matters. And it matters a great deal to get it right from the beginning.
You mentioned having a volunteer. One of the things that I see a lot of small organizations try to do is run things like this with volunteers. I think a lot of times you get what you pay for. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't try to use a volunteer, but you want to make sure you've got a volunteer who knows what they're doing, has done nonprofit accounting. So not just they're a great CPA or they work as a bookkeeper somewhere, but that they understand nonprofit and that they know what they're doing. I'm like you, Greg. I've seen a lot of mess, and I've seen some organizations try to do this on the cheap, and it really backfires.
Yeah, it really does, and it hurts everybody involved, including the volunteer. The last thing you want to do is set somebody up for failure who is giving of their time and resources to help out the organization. It's one thing to use a volunteer at a fundraising event or use a volunteer in your active conduct of your programs because they've got a heart for the mission of the organization. It's a whole nother thing to try to shoehorn somebody into this role that it's not a good fit for them.
Amen. Oh my gosh, amen. To me, I think even when you don't have a whole lot of money to spend, this is a place to invest some money to get this done right.
Yep, the horror stories speak for themselves.
And I bet you and I could tell a couple.
More than a few.
So one of the things I want us to talk some about today is best practice, because I know in Project SmartSprout we have a lot of organizations that are new. They maybe just have their 501c3 or they're young. Maybe they're only a couple of years old. And I think that as with anything, if you set something up right from the beginning, it's so much easier to work with later. If you make a mess of your QuickBooks file early on, it takes a lot of work to go back and clean it up. So I thought it might be good to define what we mean by best practice.
Yeah.
What does it mean to you when I say best practice?
The way that we tend to use that term, and we actually use it a lot. We use it in everything from blog articles, marketing content, to conversations with clients, and even internal planning. I mean, that's really a cornerstone of how we try to approach our work, is from a best practice standpoint. And the way that we define that term is best practice is the method of doing something that is most likely to result in success. And that may or may not be what most other people are doing. I think that's where a lot of people, in our view, misdefine best practice, is they will kind of see that as synonymous with most common practice. That can be true, but most of the time it isn't, honestly. And that, I think that's even more true in the nonprofit space.
Mm-hmm. For me, and I guess coming from the fundraising side, to me, best practice is something that's been proven to work. It's been proven to be effective. It's proven to be efficient. And why wouldn't you do it that way?
Yeah, I like that. I like that as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think if we marry both of our perspectives and definitions, we get something that really works. And I don't know about the rest of you, but when I'm brand new to something, it's very common for me to go look online to try to find information, and I want to know what's best practice in whatever this thing is I'm looking for, so that I don't waste a lot of time and I'm not reinventing the wheel. So what we're going to do from here for everybody is we're going to talk about some things that that we think are best practice when it comes to accounting for small nonprofits. And this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch. I'm sure there's probably hundreds more things that could be shared or that we could pluck out of Greg's head. But this will get you started. These are some of the biggest pieces. And if you've got the handout, you can kind of follow along with these and make some notes. We're going to start with controls. Controls to minimize risk and fraud. And I'm going to let you start on this one, Greg.
Yeah, and the definition of controls, I mean, the controls can be thought of as procedures, policies that are in place with regard to, it's more than just the bookkeeping side of it or the what ends up on an IRS filing or a state filing. What we're talking about right here begins really at the point that you start dealing with any type of money situation at all. This is controls have to do with how money is handled, how donations are received, how they're deposited into a bank account, how they're receipted. So the definition of control really begins at the very beginning of when you're dealing with the financial relationship with a donor or what have you, a program participant, it doesn't matter. But controls need to be in place that define the process for handling funds through every stage that you're going to encounter in dealing with those funds, and making sure that that is not only systematic, but that it is understood by those involved, whether they're employees, whether they're volunteers, and that it's followed consistently.
Yep, I can remember when I was a development director, there were all kinds of things that we put in place that were meant to ensure that any kind of risk was minimized. Not that we looked around at each other and said, you look a little suspicious. I think you might be thinking of something you could do to take advantage of this organization. But I think it was really smart just to protect our folks, protect our staff and our volunteers and the organization. And,
yep.
And I think it's really easy, especially for young organizations. If your volunteers are your friends and family, you may be thinking, I know these people, I trust these people, nothing's going to happen. But what you need to do is put things in place in your organization that works for now. And as you grow and you have to bring in other people, you already got the controls in place, so you're set.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and minimizing fraud and risk is critical for the organization, but so is protecting the integrity and reputation of the people that you've got involved. And if you have the right controls in place, then you don't put your people at risk.
Mm-hmm. Yep. One of the things that we ran into when I was at Second Harvest, because we had a couple of events where we were handling large amounts of cash. We did a crazy little towel sale at a UT football game, and the last year I was there, we counted $43,000 in cash. It was the craziest thing I've ever seen, and we had to put a couple of things in place to make sure that number one, there was always more than one person with that giant bag of cash, because that was a little scary, and things like how we did the night deposit and who did the night deposit and what records we kept about everything, and we put a lot in place that year about how we handled cash, just so that if anybody ever had a question, we could go back and say, well, here's our policy and here's the here's the check and balance on all of that. And it really helped. And I think it was a really smart thing to do. Not that anything weird ever happened, but it like you said, it was protection.
Yeah, and there's a situation that we encountered. This was way back. This was probably 15 years ago. But we had, in the Nashville area where we are, there's lots of historic homes and museums and that sort of thing. And we had one of the ones here in Nashville, of the dozens that are here, contact us about wanting us to come in and kind of look over their books. And as we started talking to them more prior to the engagement, really what they wanted us to come in there and do was not necessarily their day-to-day, but they wanted us on a monthly basis to take a look at their books and reconcile their accounts, things like that, because they were, wanting to make sure there was proper oversight. Well, we got in there, started looking at things, trying to reconcile the accounts, and it took us not very long at all to figure out that something was very much not right. And it took about 3 or 4 days of digging through their records to realize that someone had embezzled about $65,000
Oh my gosh.
over the course of the prior 18 months, and it was the organization's secretary, a paid staff member. But that paid staff member was exclusively in charge of receiving money, depositing money, writing checks, doing the bookkeeping, and reconciling the accounts, and had zero oversight by anyone. And over the course of a year and a half, she walked off with $65,000. And what was even more amazing is that when we realized this and brought it to the attention of the board made the strategic decision not to pursue criminal legal action against the thief, because they didn't want to be embarrassed in front of their donors because of their lack of controls.
Wow.
They chose to cover it up so that they would not be embarrassed for having dropped the ball like they did.
Well, that's an interesting decision. I certainly respect that, because that news going public could do a lot of damage.
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely it could, and it was such an avoidable situation if they just had either a third-party professional looking over the stuff from the beginning, or even somebody else that had co-responsibility for making sure that stuff was straight. There's no way it would have happened the way it did.
It's so sad, and it's so common. That made me think of a very small animal rescue group that I know about in Missouri that had their board treasurer. It's all volunteer. No, that's not true. Their founder gets a small stipend, and their board treasurer embezzled over $100,000 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's not. And the same thing. There was nobody else watching. They were totally trusting that she was doing the right thing, and she had a gambling problem. And
yeah.
So there it went. All right. So I hope everybody is frightened enough to know that, like, this is serious. You want to take this seriously, even if it's you and a couple of your close friends that are running your organization. You need to put stuff in place so that as you grow, it's there to protect you, your staff, your volunteers, and your reputation. And interestingly enough, that I love that you went right to, we got to have multiple people involved, because that's our next point.
Yep. Well, and this is the very case that we dealt with this historic home museum. If there had been multiple people, this wouldn't have happened. But here's the other side of that coin. If you've got valuable volunteers or valuable employees, and you're putting them in a position where there's no oversight, if something goes sideways that maybe is not their fault, they're still usually blamed anyway. And so it's not just a matter of protecting the organization. It's also about protecting the reputation and integrity of the person that you're putting in that position unnecessarily.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep, I think that's an excellent point as well. Excellent point. I'm not sure there's much more we can say about that, other than you need at least 2 people involved in the process. And you mentioned earlier, from opening the mail and getting the checks, to preparing the deposits, to actually taking the deposits to the bank and then putting everything in the system, there needs to be more than one person involved. And for folks listening, when your organization gets big enough that you are able to have an independent audit where you can have somebody, a professional, come in and look at your books, that's probably something they're going to recommend if you're not already doing it.
Yeah, it is, especially in an audit situation. Any audit firm is going to recommend that. And even if you're a smaller organization that's not approaching, if you're not getting anywhere near those audit thresholds, having an outside professional that can look at that on a regular basis. Maybe you're doing your day-to-day, and only the professional is logging in once a month and doing your bank reconciliation. Just that alone is a second set of educated eyes looking at what's going on, and that certainly goes a long way toward helping.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Written policies for handling money and records. Well, I see one of my team is on here, and she's going to be going, yes, we need things in writing. We need policies in writing and procedures. And I think it's really important that every organization have some things in writing, so that when questions come up, it's already been thought about and voted on, and it's in writing about how you're going to handle things. What would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely critical that it's written down, because you can't be consistent in any type of operational procedure if you don't have it written down. There's no way you can. But the other side of that is, I like the old saying that you can only expect what you inspect. So it's great that you've got it written down, but it's got to be more than that. You've got to consistently follow it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know for a lot of people, documentation is not fun. It's not. It may seem like it's the bottom of the priority list, but for a small organization, if you take one thing at a time and think it through and get it documented over the course of a year, you can get quite a few things done. The other way to do it is wait until there's a problem and go, oh yeah, we probably need a policy for that. And deal with the problem, put the policy in place, and then move on. And it's smooth sailing until you hit the next bump.
Well, and one of the things that we often see is people don't start taking these needs seriously until their organization is sufficiently large enough or got enough irons in the fire that this becomes a major pain point. But the problem with that approach is, by the time it becomes a pain point, you probably have developed so many bad habits that unwinding those bad habits and trying to go back to a system having a system and having a consistent way of doing things properly, it's a lot harder to put that into motion once you've got deeply ingrained bad habits or shortcuts that are really how you do things.
Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking about some really common policies that everybody might want to put in place, and I think it could be as simple as things like stay on top of your data entry. Make sure that you're reconciling your bank statements every month. Like, get that stuff handled regularly. Don't let it pile up. And I have seen organizations that do that, but they're not reconciling for 6 months, and then all of a sudden it's a nightmare. Get the deposits put in the bank regularly. What else can you think of?
Yeah, that one's key. Don't leave money sitting around. That seems like an obvious thing, but for some reason it's not as obvious as you would think it would be. And we've seen a number of situations where cash has simply gotten up and walked off. So yeah, making no waste of time to get things deposited is a big one. But having a checklist to go through, especially events, I think that's one of the things where things tend to go sideways a little bit. Is on a day-to-day basis or a week-to-week basis, maybe you've got a steady stream of donor support coming in, and that's a fairly routine thing. You get checks in the mail, or people are donating online, or what have you, and you've got your procedures for handling that. But then come fundraising event time, and nobody's really thought through any process or procedure. And next thing you know, you've got money sitting in a money box somewhere. You've got checks that are floating around, getting lost with the registration forms. Unfortunately, we've seen and heard of horror stories where the money handling at events got bad enough to really cost an organization.
I had an executive director one time that I was coaching. She said to me when I walked in, she goes, "Oh my gosh, I cleaned my desk out and I found a check from 6 months ago." And I wanted to strangle her because she thought it was funny. She was giggling and thought it was funny, and I'm like, how is this okay? What does your donor think?
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
I guarantee you the donor is wondering, like, what the heck happened to that check?
Right. That's right.
Ugh. So policies are a good thing, and I bet you could probably get online and Google nonprofit financial policies and come up with all kinds of ideas of things that you could put in place. So I think the bottom line here is you can either be proactive and start thinking about what you want to put in place, or you can wait till things become a problem and deal with it then. Either way, you need to put some stuff in place.
Yeah.
And what goes right along with policies is procedures. With the difference being, policies to me are more like, we're going to draw a line in the sand here, and this is the rule. This is the way that we're going to operate. And procedures is more of the how-to, the step 1, step 2, step 3. And to me, and having had my hands involved earlier this year in a nonprofit in the accounting world, what I saw in this organization was that the data that was being entered into QuickBooks by multiple different people was all being put in multiple different ways. which meant it was really difficult to pull a report that we could feel confident in, because some people were tagging revenue with one category and other people were tagging it in a different way, and some people were putting a lot of detail in, and some people were just putting it in as general donation, and it was a mess. So I think having a procedure that says when you enter it into QuickBooks, make sure that it's coded this way. And now I know for some people that may be way too much detail and way too much nerdiness, but I think you have to. I think this is not a place where you want to scrimp. This is not a place where you want to cut corners. You got to get this right, because if you don't, and you're just putting things in willy-nilly, then your reports are no good. And you can't trust what you're getting back out of your software.
Well, I would even go so far as to put an exclamation point behind this sentence. It is absolutely essential that it is consistent how things are recorded. You get in a situation, just like you said, you get in a situation where one person has a mindset for how something ought to be recorded, and somebody else in the organization is taking the very same thing and recording it in a different way. You can have zero confidence in your reports. I mean, there's no consistency. You don't know what's real. And it's absolutely essential, not just from a standpoint of compliance. That's an obvious thing. Your accounting records need to be compliant with the rules and regulations of what goes into that, and we're going to cover that here coming up, I know. But also just from a standpoint of looking at and governing your organization and planning for the future, and by looking back on the past. If is not consistently documented the same way by everyone, then how do you know what to forecast in the future when you have no confidence in what you're looking at with regard to the past?
Yes. Yeah, or if you're looking at, just name a line item like, oh, how did we do on Giving Tuesday last year? And you pull a number and it looks like you did $100,000 on Giving Tuesday last year when in fact you only did $1,100 because all kinds of revenue got blocked wrong. You're going to make decisions that could be very hurtful to the organization because your numbers aren't good.
Yeah, that's right. And especially with the smaller organizations and especially ones that have multiple hands having access to the accounting records. Checks and balances are good, but there's also the risk inherent with multiple people having access to the accounting records. All the more reason that there needs to be a final accountability with regard to what the final records are. That accountability needs to rest with someone that is either knowledgeable insider or a professional outsider. But the final reports that are the final financial reports that are going to go to make up any type of compliance filing, or for that matter, any budgeting documents for the next year, somebody needs to be accountable for the final version of that actually knows how things are supposed to be done.
Yep. All right, so hopefully everybody's got the fear of God struck in them about this. It's really important. It's really important to put some procedures in place. Again, even if it's only you, right now and you're the one banging away on QuickBooks, that's fine. But what you need to do is document how you're coding things so that when you do pull somebody else in, they'll do it the same way that you do it. This is a time, and I say this to a lot of people, this is a time to let your control freak flag shine. Let it wave. You want to be in control? No problem. Document exactly how you want things done, and then make sure other people are doing it that way. Let's talk about GAAP or GAAP and IRS regulations. And I know this is another one where you could probably talk for the next 3 hours without taking a breath. But let's talk about why it's important for people to understand these regulations and implications of the regulations.
Yeah, and this is the part of the conversation where eyes tend to glaze over, and we get that. I mean, like Sandy said, ours may not be the sexiest side of nonprofit, but it's also the side of a nonprofit that will keep you on the straight and narrow. And look, I mean, it's an obvious thing that the average volunteer in the average nonprofit is not going to be an expert on IRS regulations or GAAP accounting. And if you're curious what this weird spelling of GAAP is, that's actually an acronym that stands for Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. And this is, there's a governing body in the U.S. that determines what GAAP is, what the rules are, and that changes from time to time. There's been significant changes in the last several years in the way that the GAAP rules treat restricted revenue, for example, with regard to nonprofits. A few years ago, and for a long time prior, there used to be two versions of restricted revenue, temporary and permanent. Well, the whole temporary concept has now gone away and is not considered a legitimate accounting principle anymore. So this is a moving target, and it is not a fair expectation that the average volunteer or the average nonprofit is going to understand this inside and out. And that's why relying on an expert to help guide you through, at least if nothing else, getting you set up right, getting your chart of accounts set up right, what have you, it's absolutely essential, because if you don't understand the way the IRS expects you to record and account for your money flow, and it's not just income and expenses. Those are transactions that happen on what we call the profit and loss statement or the income statement. But you've also got other money flows as far as borrowing money, paying money back, things that take place only on the balance sheet. And both, I may have lost half of you already, and I understand that. But the IRS doesn't give you a pass on the accounting rules simply because you don't understand them. And I think that's where a lot of people, especially dealing with smaller nonprofits, I think that's where they kind of fall down a little bit. They just think, well, we're just this little organization, nobody really cares. Well, yeah, actually they do. And there are very strict rules with regard to how you record revenue, how you record expenses, and in what categories that you count them. That is especially true when you're dealing with what is called restricted funds. If there's an issue that we see confusion on right at the top of the list, it's restricted funds. And that is, so what's restricted funds? Restricted funds are monies that the donor has put a designation on, and the organization has received those funds in light of that designation. In other words, Sally wants to donate $10,000 for a particular purpose or a particular mission within the organization, a particular program, and the organization gladly receives that $10,000 with that being the understanding of what it's going to be used for. Well, that becomes a permanently restricted asset. That money can't be turned around and used to pay the light bill if it was given to build the next facility. So not knowing how to account for those things and to protect those funds, that's an issue that can get an organization pretty sideways with both state and federal governments really quickly.
Which is not a place you want to be.
No.
So, to me, this seems like, especially for those who are really new, it would be really worthwhile to invest in having somebody to help set things up correctly from the beginning, and then advise the founder on some places that they really want to pay attention so that they don't get into trouble later.
Yeah, that's right. And once an organization starts growing, here in the state of Tennessee where we are, and where Sandy is as well, the Department of Charitable Solicitations requires any charity in the state of Tennessee that raises more than $500,000 per year to be audited by a CPA firm. And that has to happen every year that the organization is over $500,000 in revenue. And you may be sitting there thinking, well, we're 10% of that number. And that's great. But the responsibility for you to account at the same accuracy level as the organization over $500,000 isn't any different.
Yep. All right. Everybody's probably not breathing very much at this point. So everybody have a breath. It's all okay. I know this is some heavy stuff. There's a lot of things here that you got to make sure you get right. And that's one of the reasons why I invited Greg to come in and have this conversation and lead this webinar today, because I know there's so much, and I don't want anybody getting in trouble with this or having a mess on their hands. So again, there's probably another 3 hours worth of stuff we could talk about here with GAAP and IRS regulations. Let's just say this is really important, and if you're not sure, if you even have a basic understanding, you need to dig deeper into this particular one and understand it. And some of it's simple, like you've got some requirements to file a Form 990 every year. If you don't know what that is, Greg can talk to you about that. He's got a whole department of his staff that handle getting 990s prepared for people. Let's talk about regular financial reports. This is important. I don't think that you can operate very long if you're not keeping a really close eye on your finances. I love what Greg said earlier about you can't you can only affect what you inspect. I say you can't manage what you don't measure, and so if you're not looking at your finances regularly, it's going to be really hard to manage. It's hard to know how much money you have, and I think it's not enough for you as the founder to go, oh yeah, I got it, whatever, I looked at it last week. Your board actually has a responsibility to be looking at those with you, even if your board members right now don't really understand that. And I know you have a lot to add to that, Greg, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, and I think this is something, what you were alluding to right there, is lost on a lot of smaller organizations. It is so common when we're dealing with the really small organizations that maybe your board of directors, half of your board signed on to be a board member simply because they like you and they're doing you a favor. And that's great, maybe, hopefully, that they're there for you. But what a lot of times is missed is that if you are a board member of an organization, you have a fiduciary responsibility for making sure that revenue and expenses are handled in a compliant manner, whether you know about what's going on or not. I'll go back to the situation of the embezzlement that we dealt with years ago. You know, that's a situation where, you know, not only did the board not want donors to know, but this organization was large enough that the board members realized that, you know, we could be held accountable for breach of responsibility for making sure that there were systems in place to prevent such a thing from happening. And, you know, in a situation where, you know, let's say you've got sort of an absentee board and you've got an executive director maybe that is not stealing money, but definitely using the resources of the organization to benefit themselves personally. Well, the board of directors can be personally fined by the IRS for not making sure that those systems are in place to make sure that this person doesn't unfairly benefit. That's a concept the IRS calls inurement. But besides that part of it, I think the more important part of it is not the penalty side of it. The more important side of it is the functional success of the organization. If your leadership team is not aware of the financial health of the organization on a regular basis, then it's impossible for them to make the right decisions about the future of the organization. And one of the things that we often see with nonprofit board members is they simply don't understand how to read financial statements. That's really common. That's not a negative. That doesn't make them less of a resource because they don't have this skill. But this skill is learnable. You know, there's documents you can download. There's pre-recorded webinars all over the web that can train board members to at least have a base level understanding of what they're looking at. So if you've got an external accountant or even an internal volunteer that knows what they're doing, producing financial reports for board meetings, it's really kind of important to make sure your board knows how to look at that and interpret what's being said.
Yes. Yeah, and I don't know about you, but I see a lot of boards where people go, well, I'm not a numbers person, so I'm gonna let Jimmy Joe look at that because I know he works at the bank and he understands this stuff, and they think they've just let themselves off the hook, and that's not the case at all. So even if you're not a numbers person, you still have a responsibility as a board member to understand this stuff or to learn it, and I think that's important. Every time we talk about boards, I think about Becky, and she just rolls her eyes every time we talk about boards because she's got one of those boards that it's a couple of people that she had to beg to say yes to be on the board, and they don't really do anything. And gosh, even just looking at financials. And so there's a whole other conversation we can have here about boards. And for some of you, your board is not going to look like this picture on the screen. These people are a little too happy, in my opinion, to be looking at financials. Most people are frowning when they look at financials because they don't know what they're looking at. So to Greg's point, if your board doesn't understand, get them some training. Show them what they need to know and try to make it easy. Along with financial reports, if you can create some sort of a dashboard or at least identify some key metrics that you want to keep an eye on with your organization, that can help them better understand whether the organization is moving forward or back or just stagnant. And I think that's super helpful as well.
Yep, totally agree.
Okay, so regular financial reports and review, that's an important thing. I would recommend monthly. I think if your board only meets quarterly and you're looking at financials quarterly, you can be in a pretty big mess really fast before anybody has a chance to go, wait a minute, what is this? You want to be able to, you really want a couple of people on your board who can help you look down the road for red flags. So they're looking at financials, they're looking at your budget, and they can help you figure out what's coming, or that there's danger coming, or that it's going to be time to think about another fundraising activity because you're going to have too many expenses, any of those kind of things. If you're not looking at your reports regularly, you won't see any of that.
Yep, I agree.
And I have to say, I'm just sitting here laughing at myself of all this stuff that I know. When I started in nonprofit, I was one of those people that said, I'm not a numbers person. I don't get any of this. And now look. Now I'm like, monthly financial reports. Let's go. We got to see this stuff. I think it's funny. Knowledgeable and capable bookkeeper. I think this one's super important. We've actually already told a couple of really good horror stories about what can happen when you don't. But I think it's really critical that whoever is handling the keeping up with all the records and putting stuff in QuickBooks and all that is knowledgeable and is doing a good job for you.
Yeah, that's right. And even if you're the one tasked with doing it, let's say that you are the inevitable volunteer that gets tasked with this role. Maybe you're the board treasurer, and that's more literal than figurative, and because sometimes it is figurative in a lot of organizations, but let's say it's literal for you. If you know that you're not 100% up to speed on what's required of you, that's okay. That's not the end of the world. Make sure that you've got a backup of a professional that can look at it and get you course corrected in a timely manner, as opposed to either not at all, which is the worst, or slightly better but not a lot better is once a year. One of the issues that we deal with at Form 990 time, and we file Form 990 for hundreds of clients, and one of the issues that we deal with that's such a mess is situations where an organization does not have a knowledgeable or capable bookkeeper. So what they send us for financial records is just this jumbled pile of garbage that we can't even put together an accurate return. And so we end up having to charge more money to the client, to the organization, to sort back through and virtually recreate a set of compliant books that we can even use to file returns with. And that pain can be avoided if you've got somebody, at least as a backstop, who can look at things on a regular basis and knows what they're looking at and looking for.
We were having a conversation in our office the other day about how many organizations have what we consider crotchety bookkeepers. They've got somebody in that spot who only does things one way. They're very inflexible. They've been there a really long time. And then when the fundraiser comes along and says, oh gosh, we need to, can we track this certain thing a different way? The person's like, no, I only do it this way.
Yeah, yep. We see it, or we see people get offended. That's the part that just baffles me. But we see it. You know, we find or uncover a really nasty situation, go back to this individual, and never accusatory, but just simply informatively, hey, we see something here that's a major big deal about the way that you're accounting for some things. We need to talk through this. And it doesn't happen every time or even most of the time, but it is always fascinating to us the relative frequency that we run into people that when you try to help them course correct, they're just so defensive about the way they did it. And that they would rather be right than do right. And that's I'll never stop being weirded out by that.
That's crazy. Detailed organizational budget. This one is really important. I'm astonished at the organizations that are quite large that have 6 line items on their budget, which is not enough. So here's the deal. if you want to go after grants at some point, you need a detailed budget so that you can show by way of numbers what your organization is doing and how much revenue is coming in, what the expenses look like, and that sort of thing. But also from just a sheer management point of view, you need to know where you're spending money so you can make decisions about if you want to continue spending money in those places and if your revenue streams are what you need them to be.
Well, and you can't strategically plan for the future if you don't have a handle on what you expect to receive and spend. In about 6 hours from now, I'm going to be in a nonprofit board meeting myself for the very purpose of our board going over a 2019 budget for this organization I serve with. And so I'm about to practice what I preach here in just a few hours. This is absolutely critical and essential if you're going to have any ability as a leader of a nonprofit to keep this organization steered in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. It's important for so many reasons. Enough said. Now, here's the deal, you guys. I know for some of you, if you're brand new, you may be going, great, I want to do a detailed budget, but I don't have any clue what goes into one. I think earlier this year in a Tool Time Tuesday, we shared a budget template. And if we didn't, I'm really sure we did. If some of you are interested, just post in the Facebook group and ask me, and I can share that again. Or Leah's on here, she can drop something, and we can get you a sample budget with some really commonly used categories, just so you can see what a good starting spot might look like. I want to talk a little bit about a rainy day fund or reserve. This is something that as your organization grows, you may want to create for yourself, just to have a little slush fund in case you have those times of famine instead of it all being feast. It's perfectly okay for a nonprofit to have a reserve or a rainy day fund. And it's actually not a bad idea at all that just as you grow, sometimes it's a little difficult to make sure that the revenue streams are keeping up with your growth. And sometimes just having a little extra money that you can use 1 month to cover payroll or to help with some increased expenses can be a really handy thing. Anything that people need to keep an eye out for as they're thinking about a reserve, Greg?
I don't know if there's any one particular thing. I think about what we observed. We've been in business long enough here at Foundation Group to see a lot of economic cycles. You know, we've been here over 20 years, and one of the things that we saw pretty painfully was back during the late 2008, 2009, 2010 season, we saw an awful lot of organizations just cease to exist. The Great Recession, everybody thinks about what it did to business and they don't really think so much about what it did to nonprofits. But the death rate of small charities was pretty brutal back then. And so many of those organizations had failed to put any kind of reserve or rainy day fund aside when things were great. You know, when things were just booming in 05, 06, 07, and it looked like the party would never stop. Budgets kept getting bigger, projects got bigger, missions got expanded, and that's all great. I mean, when things are great, take advantage of it. But there's a discipline involved when things are good to set things aside, because business cycles will never be repealed. They're never going away. And we're kind of in that zone right now. 2017, 2018, you've got record GDP, at least over the last number of years. You've absolutely got record low unemployment. So from a standpoint of the way things are humming, yeah, it could be a lot worse. Now is exactly the time that you want to be socking some money away to make sure that when the music does eventually stop, you've got a chair to sit in.
Mm-hmm. One of my new clients, a group that I just started working with a couple of months ago, when they came to me, they said, okay, so here's our story. It's an animal rescue group. They had bought a facility and they needed to up-level their fundraising. They have $1 million in their reserve. And I was like, what? That is crazy. They had some people that just really were uncomfortable not having a very large chunk of cash in their mattress. And so they did that. And the nice thing about it was, even though they didn't have money in their operating budget to hire me as a coach, they were able to pull it out of that rainy day, invest it in themselves, in their capacity building, and already they have made their money back just because we hit a home run on Giving Tuesday for them, which was awesome. But I think that is such a cool thing about a reserve is that it can allow you to make some really strategic decisions at a time when otherwise you might not have the money in your regular checking account.
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes you also have to resist the voices of those who would say, look what we could be doing with this money.
Yeah.
The organization that I'm talking about that I'm heading to the board meeting of here in a few hours, this organization has roughly $350,000 sitting in reserve.
Nice.
And this is an organization with about a $3.5 million budget. So we've got roughly 10% of our annual budget sitting in a rainy day fund. And that's intentional. And there are a few people that would like to be leveraging that toward program. But I'm one of the majority that believe that there's a lot of wisdom in making sure that you're ready when the business cycle eventually turns down.
Completely agree. I think a reserve is a good idea for any organization. And what comes right along with that, or maybe the opposite of that, is debt management and credit cards. So what if you don't have a big reserve, but you still want to invest in some things, or you need to be able to pay for things quickly? I think about a horse rescue group that I've been involved with that sometimes they're out on the road picking up horses, and they've got trucks, and they need to put gas in the trucks, and having an organizational credit card made that super easy to do. I think you have to be really smart, and here's a place where you may want to have some policies in place about who gets an organizational credit card and how they use it and what debt the organization agrees to take on. And this is definitely a place where you want to have your board involved in the conversation. And I think you want to pre-think this stuff instead of just like, oh, hooray, I got a credit card for us, and now we can go spend money, yay.
Yeah, because payday always comes, and I think it's incumbent on the board to set limits. And it's not just the limit that Capital One gives you on the card. You know, the board needs to set limits as to how much debt it's willing to have on its books. And never forget, if you're dealing with credit card debt, you know, this is not going into personal finance, but it's just a reality. Credit card interest rates are not 3 and 4% typically. You know, even if you manage to get one of these introductory rates, eventually it's going to tick up into some pretty heavy double digits. So managing debt and making sure that you've already predetermined how much you're willing to put out there is important on the front end to be able to manage it. And if you can, don't go into debt at all if it's possible. If you can put things on a card for convenience sake and pay it off at the end of the month, that's an even better situation to be in. One of the things that I've got to say about credit card, and this actually comes up and leads, I think, into Sandy's next slide, one of the things that we unfortunately see oftentimes is that organizations will take the shortcut of not getting, if they're going to get credit cards, they won't get it in the organization's name. They'll just use the executive director's personal credit card for expenses and then try to pay that stuff off. That's a nightmare. Don't ever do that. That's what's called commingling of funds. And the IRS hates it. Your state attorney general's office hates it. Nobody that you're accountable to likes that. If you're going to use any type of credit cards or anything like that, debit cards, what have you, take the extra step to make sure that the primary borrower or the person whose name is at the top of the account is your organization's name. That's really.
I agree. And I would say shop those things around, because you may find either a local bank that will work with you on all your accounts, your rainy day fund, your checking account, and a credit card to give you some really good rates, or to be somebody who might sponsor your event because you're doing business with them. So definitely shop around with a small bank, a small town bank. I've seen that happen successfully several times. And I'm a huge proponent of using a credit card, not a debit card. I think you are setting yourself up for disaster if you are using your organization's debit card out in the community. There's just too much identity theft and skimming of numbers and things like that. Just don't. Get a credit card, use it for what you need to, pay it off every month. Do not use a debit card.
Yep, agree with that as well. And dealing with credit cards, I want to kind of flip the script a little bit to the other scenario. We talked about the issue that we see a lot of organizations using a volunteer or an employee or a director's personal credit cards. That's bad. What we often see also is the other. Let's say an organization actually goes through with the step of getting a credit card in the organization's name, but then the executive director, who for some reason has managed to develop dictator syndrome, doesn't really see a problem expensing personal items on the organization's credit card and then eventually getting around to reimbursing the charity for that. Absolutely do not ever do that. It is not okay even once to charge personal expenses on an organizational credit card or to write a check out of the organization's funds to pay a personal bill, even if you fully intend to pay it back. There's not a scenario that that's okay with. In fact, anytime that an individual someone spends organizational funds on a personal purpose, that automatically creates essentially what is a de facto loan to that individual. And the reality is, what a lot of people don't realize in a nonprofit is most states prohibit lending from an organization to their key staff or directors. State of Tennessee is definitely one of those. It is totally against state law for an organization to lend money to an officer or a director of that organization. And you create an implicit loan anytime that you're using organizational funds for personal use. And you also get into a situation that, let's say you can't pay the money back. One of the interesting things, I'll go back to that embezzlement case, is I worked through the bank accounts going back over that 18 months. One of the things that stood out to me is the individual who stole the $65,000. In the early weeks and months of that money disappearing, there was also mysterious deposits coming back in that didn't seem to have a source. And it sort of painted a picture of someone using organizational money for personal purposes and attempting to pay it back early on, and then eventually it just snowballed out of control, or they just quit trying. But it was interesting that in the early period of that time, this individual was trying to pay some money back that they were taking. So this is never a situation that's okay.
Yeah, one other example that I want to bring up is one that you and I talked about the other day, Greg, and that is when you're the founder of an organization, and I'm going to use a horse rescue as an example because this is easy to understand. If you have horses and you have property like I do, and you have a barn and you're like, wow, I have more property than I'm using right now, I think I'll start a horse rescue and I'm going to keep the rescued horses right here in my backyard. That's fine, you can do that, but you've got to keep things very, very separate. All the eggs for the organization have to go in the organization's basket. Your personal stuff has to go in your personal basket. And this gets really subtle, and even into things like, if donors give you money for hay, you can only feed that hay to the nonprofit's rescued horses. You can't feed that hay to your own horses. You have to pay for hay out of your own personal funds and keep that. I would literally keep that hay separate in the barn and make sure that you're feeding your own personal horses out of that stash of hay that you've paid for personally. Now, this seems like nitty-gritty, ridiculous, are you kidding me kind of stuff, but no, this is serious business, and the last thing that you want is for a donor to think, I'm not giving you money because you're feeding your own horses with it.
Yep, you got it.
And that can come up in a lot of different ways. So depending on what your organization is, if you, like, for example, if you use organization funds to buy a laptop, great. That laptop is now property of your nonprofit. It is not your personal laptop, even though you may be using it to do laptop work. And you've got to keep this stuff separate. And I know, again, it sounds really crazy, but if you just get in the habit of paying for organizational stuff with organizational funds, keeping the use separate, you will have so much less headache later.
Yep, I couldn't agree more.
And I know when you're the founder and you're excited and you're getting this stuff up and running, you may be like, wait, what? But again, you got to get this stuff right from the beginning so that it helps you avoid problems later. And I'm looking at the clock going, wow, we have blazed a trail through all of these things. I think we could probably talk on for easily another hour, probably 2 or 3. There's so much. So you guys, a couple of things I want you to know. Number one, Greg has a ton of information on his website, and you can find it conveniently at 501c3.org. There's, excuse me, there's a whole bunch of blog posts that go into detail on some of these things. And I would recommend you go poke around on his site and just take advantage of that. He's got a lot of information there. You may as well read it, read up on it, learn what you can. And then you have a program as well for folks who want some ongoing support, don't you?
Yeah, we have several programs from the compliance side. One, starting back in early 2018, we brought back monthly bookkeeping services that we had not done for quite a while, but based on some client demand and just actually as a feeder system into our Form 990 prep work, it just made a lot of sense. So we actually provide bookkeeping services for charities all across the country, and we've got a network of bookkeepers that we work with to do that. And we also have what's called our assurance program, and that's really, it's kind of a subscription economy. You get used to paying $10 a month to Planet Fitness or $10 a month to Netflix, but we also have a monthly subscription-based service that provides consulting access to our team, as well as Form 990 preparation on an annual basis, and charitable solicitation registration in your state on an annual basis. And details on all those programs can be found on our website at 501c3.org.
Coolness. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be here, Greg. I'm delighted to be able to put this recording in our training library. I think there's some really amazing nuggets of wisdom here for folks. And for those of you who are listening, whether you're live or on the recording, if you have questions, the Facebook group is always open, and you can pop in there anytime to ask. So, Greg, thank you again for being here. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was fun.
Yep. All right, you guys. So last thing I do want to share, if I can get the slide to move forward, and that is what's coming up next. We have one last webinar in December. It's on the top 3 things you need in place before you ask for money. So it's more of this behind-the-scenes stuff, getting you ready to go out and ask strongly. And then our first webinar up in January in the brand new year is January 3rd, and that's about finding your next 100 donors. So we'll be talking about cost-effective and free ways that you can go find new supporters for your organization. So that is it for today. Thank you all for being here. We'll see you guys again next time. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.